All right, and we're back with another budget build. I actually just sold this one Wednesday at my local game store. Every Wednesday night is Commander Night, and I was piloting Ghen, Arcanum Weaver, to a miserable efficiency. His ability to grind the game down for those 4, 5, and 6 power level decks was impressive. It was only a 3-player game, but I held the other 2 people at bay, and albeit I had some really good top decks, but I really made them suffer. So let's get into it. Starting off, we'll go ahead and go over our ramp package. That card needs no explanation. We also have the full diamond set for Gehen. Ramp is really important, and just making sure we have all of our colors to cast him on turn 3 is super relevant. The final 2 cost is a Millery Sphere. Getting extra lands for our hand can be pretty important. We do have ways to discard cards for extra value, but it hits the battlefield, you pay 2, sacrifice it, and you can grab 2 lands. It's useful. We have Commander Sphere, and this is our last piece of ramp. It comes online a little later than we would like, but the fact that we can sacrifice it to draw a card is useful for the budget. And that is our ramp package. Moving on, we have our single target removal, because Gehen, as I built him, is a pretty controlling deck, being able to flick enchantments back and forth from the graveyard to make full use. The deck does play pretty slowly. Unless you have untap effects, which this deck does not, you're only going to be able to utilize Gehen once a turn, and that can be pretty rough. It's going to make you really question your decision making. But starting off with our single target removal, we have Dreadbore. Destroy target creature or planeswalker for a red and a black. Very useful. Next is Oath of Chandra. This is the first enchantment, and this is actually a very useful card in this deck. We are not playing any planeswalkers to make use of the second ability that deals damage to each opponent, but the first ability, when it enters to lightning bolt something, is quite relevant. On top of the fact that we can sacrifice it to Gehen to get back a more powerful enchantment from our graveyard. So this is almost a repeatable lightning bolt. Next is Oath of Kaya, which is really the exact same as Oath of Chandra, but this is going to hit anything, and it will gain us some life. So just being able to loop these 2 cards, just these 2 cards back and forth, that's going to be 6 damage, 3 to a creature, 3 to anything else. It can be pretty powerful on its own. Next, Doom Foretold. Don't know how many of you have played against this wonderful, wonderful card in Standard right now, but Doom Foretold is quite powerful, forcing your opponents to sacrifice non-land, non-token permanents at the beginning of their upkeep. However, the downside of this is that it also forces you to sacrifice a non-land, non-token permanent. Doom Foretold can quickly eat up all of your enchantments on the battlefield, especially since your primary win con through grinding out the game is tokens or stealing your opponent's cards. So Doom Foretold, while it is quite powerful, it makes you a body, it gives you a card, it gives you some life, and it forces your opponents to sacrifice. You really have to be careful when you play it, but it's still worth a slot. This one, I laughed so hard when I played this. Haphazard Bombardment. 6 mana from Dominaria enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, choose 4 non-enchantment permanents you don't control. Put an aim counter on each of them. At the beginning of your end step, if 2 or more permanents you don't control have an aim counter on them, destroy one of those permanents at random. So red's never going to be really good at getting rid of enchantments, but Haphazard and Bombardment is a glorious way to abuse Ghen by continually playing it from your graveyard, sacrificing it to get back something beneficial, something that, let's say it's Oath of Gideon that makes tokens. You get the tokens from the Oath, you sack the Oath, get back Bombardment, put 4 more counters onto 4 more permanents. You're never going to run out of stuff to blow up. You're never going to run out. You're always going to be placing counters on things. Now, do remember, this triggers at the beginning of your end step. So if you sacrifice it to Ghen during your second main phase, you're going to lose out on the destruction, but sometimes that's the price you pay. Finally, for our single target removal, we have Cruel Reality, and this card is pretty powerful. It's not going to do very much against someone who's playing tokens, and I'm not sure how many people out there run Voltron, but this is the bane of Voltron. By forcing a player to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker on their upkeep or lose 5 life, you can realistically keep them down from having anything on the board. With Cruel Reality and Doom Foretold, which I had achieved in that way too long of a game, they couldn't keep stuff on the battlefield. There was one point in time where they were paying 10 extra mana just to cast their commander. It was glorious. Next to our board wipes, we have Slaughter the Strong. Nice budget option. Lets you keep Ghen and probably a token or two while getting rid of most everything else. Commander's a battleship format. People love to play their big creatures. Slaughter the Strong is going to do exactly what its name says. Next, we have Kaya's Wrath. Board wiping gloriously. Radiant Flames. This is Converge, but 3 mana to deal 3 damage to all creatures, especially if Ghen is not on the board yet, is a good way to clean up a bunch of small creatures or a bunch of tokens that you might not have a way to handle with a card like Cruel Reality or Oath of Kaya. Next, we have Divine Reckoning. Each player chooses a creature he or she controls, destroy the rest. So this is great because it has flashback. So we get to use it twice. We get to keep our Ghen, and then we get to abuse cards like Cruel Reality and Doom Foretold to really make our opponent suffer. Next, we have Planar Outburst. destroying all non-land creatures. And this last one is kind of the hidden gem of the deck. Doomwake Giant is phenomenal. Being a 4/6 is quite relevant, and especially when we can drop multiple enchantments on the battlefield in a turn. His ability to trigger multiple times and give all of our opponent's creatures -1/-1 is going to be quite useful. That wraps up our single target and board wipe spells. Next, we will go on to card draw. First off, we have Vampiric Rites. Now, you haven't seen a lot of creatures in this deck, so why would I include Vampiric Rites? Primarily because it's a 1-mana enchantment. This is really cheap and easy to sacrifice to Ghen without a real feel bad. Not to mention the fact that if it does stick, we will be producing tokens that we can sacrifice to gain life and draw cards. I was astounded by how much mana this deck was able to produce. I'm not sure if it was just a bad shuffle or a huge land pocket, but I had quite a few turns where I was stuck with 4 or 5 lands in hand and 10, 12 lands on the battlefield. Yeah, it was a long game. Next, we have Mesa Enchantress. Whenever we cast an enchantment spell, we may draw a card. And clearly, casting enchantments to sacrifice to Ghen is what this deck wants to do. So she should be drawing us at least 1 or 2 cards a turn if she's on the battlefield. Next, we have Demonic Lore. 3 mana, black enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, draw 3 cards. At the beginning of your end step, you lose 2 life for each card in your hand. So this is a card you play, and then you sacrifice to Ghen, so you don't have the drawback of taking 6, 8, 10, maybe 12 damage. So quite beneficial. Next is a card I talked about in Kolfanor, Painful Truce. I'll play this in every budget deck that has black that is 3 or more colors, because paying 3 different color mana, paying 3 life, and drawing 3 cards is quite versatile. It's not that rare that you're going to have 1 color to cast this. In a bad situation, yeah, maybe. But you're more likely going to have 2 or 3 colors of mana to put into this. And it's good. Next, we have Treacherous Blessing. Enters the battlefield, we draw 3 cards. So whenever we cast a spell, we lose a life. And whenever it becomes the target of spell or ability, we sacrifice it. So Ghen works poorly with Treacherous Blessing, because when it... Actually, no. I read that totally wrong. Ghen does not target. Ooh, that's a fun one that I might have to look up. Becomes the target, pay 3, sacrifice. Actually, no, because this is a part of the cost. Excellent. Ghen works well with Treacherous Blessing. You just go ahead and you sacrifice it in the cost, and you have a free 3 draw. Next, we have Underworld Connections, letting us enchant a land to pay a life and draw a card. So, not bad. I did mention that we generate lots of mana in this deck, so losing 1 land to draw a card isn't really that bad. Next, we have Blood Sun. This card is Definitely strange to see, but it does draw a card, and it is going to hose all other abilities on lands except for mana abilities. And this card really shines in Gehen because while it's not a placeholder in most red decks, it serves a purpose in being unique so that if you need it, it's there. If you don't need it, it's card draw and sacrifice fodder to get back a more beneficial enchantment. That's a pretty strong theme of this stack. Having the right piece at the right time and playing your cards right at the moment that you need them. This deck requires you to make a lot of decisions and begs you to make sure that they are the right decision. Our next draw spell is Aggressive Mining. Yes, we can't play lands, but we can sacrifice a land to draw 2 cards, and we can sacrifice Aggressive Mining to Gehen for when we have a hand that is full of lands. Next is not really a draw spell, but Experimental Frenzy lets us look at the top card of our library and play the top card of our library. Unfortunately, we can't play cards from our hand, but instead of paying 4 to destroy Experimental Frenzy, how about we pay 3 and sacrifice the Frenzy when it's all burned up and we have our hand full of things we want to do. The best part is when our hand is back to being empty, we can sacrifice another enchantment, get back the Frenzy, and have an outlet for all of our mana. Finally, we have Midnight Oil. This was a card that I tried to make work in Standard desperately, but it never pulled off. Midnight Oil enters the battlefield with 7 hour counters on it. At the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card and remove 2 hour counters from Midnight Oil. Get some better clarity there. Maximum hand size is equal to the number of hour counters on Midnight Oil, and whenever you discard a card, you lose life. So how this reads, it comes in with the 7 counters. At the beginning of your upkeep, you'll draw an additional card, remove 2 counters, your hand size is 5 then, and you'll have to discard down to 5. The next turn, you'll draw another. This goes down to 3. Discarding isn't that big of a problem for this deck, having a small hand size, because we want to get our bigger enchantments in the graveyard. When this goes down to 3, you're most likely going to be sacrificing it to Gehen to get something back. That's just the point of it. Draws you an extra card. It's sacrifice fodder later. That's what Gehen wants. So that is our card draw. Now we move on to our final sub-theme before we really dive into the wacky part of this deck. So we have Intangible Virtue. Creature tokens you control get +1/+1 and have vigilance. I said tokens were going to be our main strategy for winning, and this is the first part of it. We can play it early when we don't need it to sacrifice to get back something we do need, and once we start amassing our army of tokens, we can sacrifice an enchantment to get back our buff. So our first token maker is Call the Bloodline. We can pay 1, discard a card, and make a 1/1 Black Vampire Knight token with lifelink. We can only activate this ability once each turn, but that counts our turn and each of our opponent's turns. So paying 1 discarding a fat enchantment that we can reanimate later, and making a blocker is pretty valuable. And again, we can always sacrifice Call the Bloodline when our hand is empty and we need to get something more powerful from our graveyard. Next, we have History of Benalia. This is a fun little card because of how sagas work. You're never really going to want this to get to the third counter, because after it receives the third counter, you have to sacrifice it. And you really don't want to do that. So you let it get 2 counters, you get your 2 knights, you sacrifice it to get something else back, and then later you sacrifice to get the history back, and repeat the 2-step process. 1 card, 2 tokens, 4 power, not bad. Next we have Oath of Gideon. It enters and you make 2 1/1 white core ally tokens. Again, 3-drop enchantment. Pretty cheap, makes 2 bodies. You sacrifice it later to get back something else. Our next is a little more universal, Curse of Shallow Graves. Of course, this deck plays multiple curses. Enchant the player. Whenever a player attacks enchanted player with 1 or more creatures, that attacking player may put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield tapped. Now, this is a fun little card because it gives you the ability to swap your curses around. The cruel reality that I was talking about earlier, I was bouncing that around in between those 2 other players. One person had it twice. Another person had it 3 times. The ability to instant speed drop this on someone is pretty useful. It's going to be a nice little surprise. It gives you leverage in your deal making. Hey, if you attack my opponent, I'll let you make a 2/2. Yeah. Next, we have probably our most powerful token maker for this deck, and that is Archon of Sun's Grace. Because anytime an enchantment enters the battlefield under our control, we make a 2/2 white Pegasus creature token with flying. If this does not get answered, it will get out of control. This card is insanely powerful in this deck. And our last token maker is Ethereal Absolution. This fills a special little role because not only does it buff our creatures, it shrinks our opponents, and by paying 2, a white and a black, we can exile cards from their graveyard. And if it's a creature, we get to make a 1/1 white-black spirit. It is a bit of investment, but for the other things that it does, I think that it's worth it. And that is our token making package. And last, we get into the wackier part of the deck. Because of how Ghen functions, he lets us attack from multiple angles as we need to throughout the course of the game. So let's talk about some of those unique cards that we can play because of Ghen that normally we wouldn't be able to play. One of the first cards I'm going to talk about here is Brought Back. Being able to get back 2 permanents from our graveyard that were put there this turn is going to be quite valuable. Ghen sacrificing an enchantment, and let's say we sacrifice Doom Foretold to something, to itself. Being able to get back 2 enchantments from our graveyard is gonna just keep us stocked with enchantments to just keep flipping around. Next, we have the Don't Hurt Me package, which consists of Aegis of the Gods, giving us hexproof, Hissing Miasma, and Blood Reckoning, telling people, hey, don't attack us, and Leyline of Combustion, reminding people that if they try and target us or our enchantments, they're going to take damage. So we're just going to slowly grind and drain them out. Next, we have our Protect Our Commander package. Swiftfoot Boots, Haste, and Hexproof for those mid-game plays where we drop Ghen and we want to activate them right away. We have Indestructibility, because nothing's funnier than them casting a board wipe, thinking that they're going to get rid of a Ghen, or even just a Terminate, and we activate Ghen, sacrifice an enchantment, and make him indestructible. And lastly, Benevolent Blessing, because it functions the same as Indestructibility, but it's not going to remove anything else that we might put on him. So just gaining protection from a color, going to be valuable. Protecting Ghen is relevant. Next, we have Stinkweed Imp, a blocker that's going to be quite powerful, but more importantly, recurable, because Dredge is going to do good work filling up our graveyard, and he is going to do a good job of keeping scary stuff from hitting us in the face. Next, we have Curse of Misfortunes. Curse Tutor, really. At the beginning of our upkeep, we may search our library for a curse card that doesn't have the same name as a curse attached to enchanted player, put it on the battlefield attached to them, then shuffle your library. So being able to just grab a free enchantment and stick it on someone is pretty great. This isn't a card that you have to draw. It's not a card that you have to cast. Curse of Misfortunes is just going to put another enchantment into play for you to abuse. Next, we have Molten Vortex. 1 red. You can pay a red and discard a land and deal 2 damage to target creature or player. This is a good way with all of our card draw to get rid of lands, excess lands. And it's also a good 1 mana play early game that we can sacrifice to Ghen without losing a whole lot of value. The next little part of this deck is stealing our opponent's stuff. Starting off with Dead Men's Chest. Enchant creature an opponent controls. When an enchanted creature dies, exile cards equal to its power from the top of its owner's library. You may cast non-land cards from among them for as long as they remain exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast those spells. The best part is you can do this at instant speed with Ghen on the field. That single target removal spell that's going to take out that 8/8, activate Ghen, slap Dead Man's Chest to it. Suddenly you have 8 free cards that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And it's recurable. Next, we have Stolen Strategy, a powerful battle bond enchantment that at the beginning of our upkeep we're going to exile the top card of each opponent's library. Until the end of turn, you may cast non-land cards from among those exiled cards, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. This is definitely one that we're going to be turning our 1 and 2 mana enchantments into so that we can continue to get value from our opponent's decks late into the game. Next, we have Hedonist Trove. When it enters the battlefield, we exile all cards from target opponent's graveyard. So we get to hose someone's graveyard. We get to also play lands exiled with the Trove, and we may cast non-land cards exiled with the Trove, but we can only cast one spell this way each turn. Remember how that reads each turn? That means if there's instants, we can cast those on our opponent's turn. So Hedonist Trove is just going to open up the possibilities of what we can do based on what our opponents are playing. And lastly, we have Grave Betrayal. Someone's gonna drop a board wipe? Cool! Instant speed out Grave Betrayal with Ghen. Suddenly, all those creatures that just died are now yours, and they're bigger. Like I said, this deck requires some extreme precision to play, but with the right lines in the right scenarios, this is going to be game ending. Moving on, we have draw and discard damage for all those fun wheel decks. We're going to start off with Megrim. Whenever an opponent discards a card, Megrim deals 2 damage to that player. Followed up by Fate Unraveler. Whenever an opponent draws a card, Fate Unraveler deals 1 damage to that player. And because all good things come in threes, as the Eldrazi taught us, Price of Knowledge. Players have no maximum hand size, but at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, Price of Knowledge deals damage to that player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. So we have 3 ways to punish people for discarding cards, drawing cards, or even just having a handful of 7 on their upkeep. Isn't it great? But why would you want them to have all of those cards in their hands, you ask? Well, that's a reasonable question. Why not play Spirit of the Labyrinth? Get that out instant speed when they're going to cast Wheel of Fortune. Oh, well, that's a shame. Everyone now only has 1 card in their hand. Except for the person who casts the wheel. And what happens when you're playing against that Storm player who's just going absolutely crazy? Curse of Exhaustion. The enchanted player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. Sorry. I see your combination of Bolas's Citadel and Sensei's Divining Top and Aether Flux Reservoir, and I say no. Finally, we have some encouragement for our opponents to kill each other. Curse of Stalked Prey. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to the enchanted player, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. And Curse of Bloodletting. If a source would deal damage to the enchanted player, it deals double that damage to that player instead. Wonderful, wonderful. But what happens if you play all these things and they decide they want to kill you? That's what the board wipes are for. But Faith's Fetters is a fun, interesting little card. Not only is it going to shut down a permanent from attacking, blocking, or activating its abilities, but it's also going to gain you 4 life. And you're going to get it out just when you need it on that one thing you need to stop. Ghen is a fun commander. Very, very versatile. And yes, it requires very considerate lines of play, but the payoff is huge. Thanks for checking out this budget build. Have a great day.